what did I have? I had a hard-boiled egg and some almond.
With a little more than a week left in the legislative session, the future of the Maryland Piedmont Reliability Project remains uncertain. The controversial transmission line would cut across 3 counties in the state.
You are tearing up the livelihood of a lot of farmers in Baltimore County, Carroll and Frederick.
Threatening the land and livelihoods of many Marylanders. There are bills on the table to protect people's homes and solve Maryland's energy crisis.
This bill is very simple. It provides for the protection of Maryland's farmland.
But it's not clear if they'll make it to the finish line or be left on the cutting room floor. I'm pressing lawmakers for answers and examining alternative solutions. And this, Your Voice, Your Future, Town Hall. Good evening, and thank you for joining us for Your Voice, Your Future Town Hall. I'm Mikenzie Frost. As the 2025 legislative session begins to wind down, there are still some big questions left on the table about the future of the controversial Maryland Piedmont Reliability Project. That's the proposed 70-mile transmission line that would run through Carroll, Frederick, and Baltimore counties. Just today, the state DNR decided the project's application for the project to the Public Service Commission is incomplete. The DNR says the application lacks required information. According to the Public Service Commission, PSEG is challenging the decision from the DNR and is asking the PSC to have a hearing on the issue. The PSC tells Fox 45 News it is reviewing the new filings and will determine the next steps in the case. One of the biggest concerns surrounding the project is Marylanders, whether they'll pay the price of the transmission line while reaping little benefit, saying most of the power will go to data centers in Virginia. The frustration from residents captured in an award-winning short film.
One of the most important takeaways is to understand that people who own 1 acre, 150 acres, maybe 1,000 acres somewhere, that's your space. And to have people come in with a project that doesn't benefit you, the pain that you feel in fighting for what is yours and what you have worked very hard for, we need to stand up for our property rights and our personal rights.
Fox 45's Jessica Babb has been following this story from the beginning. She has a closer look at how we got here and what's coming next.
This is absolute destruction.
On the heels of rowdy town halls and residents sharing their reality.
We want to hear about our property.
Making it clear the proposed 70-mile transmission line has worn out its welcome. The Maryland Piedmont Reliability Project threatening to cut through Baltimore, Carroll, and Frederick counties, impacting homes, farms, and preserved land in the state.
You are tearing up the livelihood of a lot of farmers.
With the developer of the line, Public Service Enterprise Group, submitting the project to the Maryland Public Service Commission at the end of last year, the fate of the project is in the hands of the PSC. They'll eventually decide to approve it or not.
Every step, it's like getting worse. You know, the feeling, the thoughts. What are we going to do? How can we stop it? Man, I hope that the Public Service Commission can help us.
On one hand, the developers of the transmission line and officials with PJM, the regional grid operator, argue the line is critical with growing energy demands like data centers and electrification, especially since the state is importing about 40% of its energy from out of state.
We believe that in order to maintain a reliable grid, new infrastructure in this state is desperately needed.
But on the other hand, residents and lawmakers, even the governor, argue the line will cause crippling consequences.
Unless there's adjustments, I don't see a plan moving forward. I have grave concerns. I still am not certain what the benefit is to Marylanders, and I'm going to stand with the people on this.
What is the benefit to Marylanders, and how can you quantify exactly what benefit Marylanders will see?
It's hard to quantify down to the penny what any type of energy infrastructure project will yield to the customers of a particular region, a particular utility, or a particular state. With respect to that line, we will see congestion benefits. We'll see the benefits of avoiding capacity constraints that we're currently seeing on transmission lines.
But how can you necessarily quantify that benefit when you even mentioned that data centers are really driving this demand, and much of those data centers are in the Virginia area?
Well, just because the data centers are outside of the jurisdiction doesn't necessarily mean that customers within the jurisdiction aren't benefiting.
And while the developers will have to prove that in front of the Public Service Commission, PSC Chair Fred Hoover says,
this is not going to be a process that is a quick process. It's actually a fairly long process.
So far, hearings have yet to be scheduled, but the developers of the transmission line are still hoping to get it up and running by 2027.
I think the expectation that the company has put in their application as to when they think this line will go in service is not realistic. It's going to be longer than that.
In the meantime, this transmission line and skyrocketing energy bills are highlighting the state's serious energy crisis and the need to generate more energy in state, especially with fossil fuel power plants closing and renewable sources producing a small sliver of energy, accounting for less than 7% of what the state does produce.
And the bottom line is the energy outlook in the state of Maryland is dire.
Leading to some lawmakers this session proposing legislation, pushing for more power sources, advocating for more nuclear energy, and trying to find ways to lower energy bills for residents.
We have to provide a path towards more Maryland-made energy. We need it cleaner than the energy we produce today, and we need it now.
Others are proposing bills trying to tackle the transmission troubles, making sure projects like the proposed Piedmont project don't leave a path of destruction.
Our state cannot and should not break its promise to these residents who have invested time, money, and care in conserving our pristine agricultural land.
In Baltimore, Jessica Babb, Fox 45 News.
We invited Governor Wes Moore to participate in this conversation this evening. We offered to send a camera crew to meet him wherever he wanted and offered him the opportunity for a phone interview, but his office denied our invitation. He did speak about the project with the co-owner of the Baltimore Sun, Armstrong Williams, at another recent town hall.
Will the power line happen in Maryland?
The PSC is the one who's going to decide that, but as I've stated publicly before, unless there are changes to what we were talking about months ago, I think they're going to have a very difficult time making it happen. There should have been a greater measure of preparation.
Did you not meet with them?
Well, we met with them recently, absolutely.
What happened?
Well, I told them exactly how I feel on this issue. That more needs to be done, and frankly, more needed to be done years ago. Part of the issue that we're having is this is a long-term problem that has not been dealt with. I am so tired of the can kicking that exists when it comes to basic policies that mean that the people of our state lose because we keep kicking cans down the road, and that is something I've said in my administration. We don't can kick.
Have you met with the MPRP people who are against it?
I've not met with them.
Will you?
I have no problem meeting with anybody and everybody, absolutely.
Joining me now is the president of the SNAP MPRP group, Joanne Frederick. Joanne, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mikenzie.
I want to start with, we just heard the governor there say that he would be happy to meet with you and your organization. Has that happened?
It has not.
Has anyone from his office reached out to you?
I had a meeting with Connor Shin, his energy policy advisor, back in August, and I have not yet gotten another response to our repeated requests for a meeting.
In August of last year, of 2024.
That's correct. Yeah.
So almost,
6 months,
right.
7 months, right.
So we also invited the governor to participate tonight. He is not here. His office declined our invitation. If he were here sitting right next to you, what would you ask him?
I have a very simple question now, and the question is to have the courage to be honest with us. If he is not going to support rural Maryland, if he is not going to support our farmers, if he is not going to protect our conserved and preserved land and ensure the health of the Bay and worry about property values dropping 40%, I would ask him to sit down face to face and tell us the truth.
Do you believe that that's where he stands on this issue?
I don't know, Mikenzie, and I think that's part of the frustration. We're going to talk about some of the legislation shortly, but if you take a step back and consider all of the things that he's said and all of the things that he hasn't said, I come to 3 possible conclusions, and I really want to be wrong, and I really look forward to the conversation with him. But the conclusions are he doesn't care what happens to Baltimore, Carroll, and Frederick County. This is not an area of expertise for him as a governor. Or 3, he prefers the strategies of utility and data center companies over the will of the people in Maryland. And again, I hope I am wrong in that, and I welcome an opportunity to sit down with him and talk about the challenges here and find a better way. We know there's a better way.
Well, he said he would meet with you, so hopefully he will make good on his word with that invitation. And if that happens, I'd love to follow up and get your thoughts on that meeting.
Absolutely.
Before we get to some of the bills, I want to talk about the recent news about the DNR and the application to the PSC from the group backing this proposal. What was your first thought when you saw this? I know it's new, so I don't know if you've had a chance to really digest everything that was in the DNR letter, but really talking about some of the deficiencies that were included. And I know some of what is included in the DNR letter is what we've heard from people who are arguing about why was this route selected over another route. And that's something that was brought up in this letter as well.
Right. So obviously relief. This was a big day, a big milestone. We're hearing from a lot of our members and a lot of our followers and supporters happy that the PPRP, DNR PPRP program recognized that this application was incomplete. None of us have been satisfied with the level of data and the level of information that really has been provided by PSEG on why this is needed and why it's located where it is and really what the impact is across the state, across the 3 counties. It's catastrophic. It is catastrophic to the residents and farmers and business owners across the 3 counties, and we're just thrilled, quite honestly, that PPRP came to the same conclusion that it's not adequate.
And now it's in the hands of the PSC to at least hold a hearing about this. Are you hopeful that the PSC, the members will look at this and, start asking some of the same questions?
My understanding of the process is that PSC can go back to PSEG and say, redo it. Mm-hmm. You haven't, met the requirement of Maryland law, and you need to, fill in those shortfalls before we can go forward. The PSC can decide to have a hearing before it's complete, et cetera, and I know you've talked to them. So what we know is we cannot rush to destroying 3 counties in Maryland. Mm-hmm. And this project deserves all of the scrutiny that every single one of us can put on it to make sure that we're serving Maryland.
Let's get to some of the bills. We have just over a week and a half left of session at this point. Mm-hmm. I know that there were several bills that were drafted surrounding this project specifically. Can you walk us through some of the key priorities for you and your group during the session?
Absolutely. I think if I look at the legislation, and there were more than 30 pieces of legislation that were related specifically to the MPRP, I really put them in 2 groups. Mm-hmm. One, let's protect the investment that we've made in Maryland, in our conserved land, in our preserved land, in our farming communities, in the mouth easements, et cetera. Let's protect that. One group of kind of legislation. And the second group of legislation was let's do a better job planning our today and planning our future.
Sure.
And I think together they give us really an opportunity to take a step back and decide who we want to be as Marylanders and decide what's important to us here. And is conserved and preserved land and our agricultural business in Maryland important? I contend yes. And then let's make sure that all the other pieces of the puzzle fill in that regard.
Let's start with protecting the investment right now, because from what I understand, the route selected goes through several pieces of property that have conservation easements and have been designated protected spaces for agricultural reasons. But the eminent domain issue is a serious concern for all of these property owners. Would the protecting the investment legislation really go into the eminent domain aspect of this and prevent that from happening if there are these protections already in place?
There was one particular piece of legislation that would have prevented eminent domain on preserved or conserved land. Mm-hmm. And that's a really simple piece of legislation and a really powerful piece of legislation. That did not make it out of committee, which is incredibly disappointing. And it sends a signal, at least to me, that perhaps we don't care about our conserved and preserved land. Maryland has spent millions, billions of dollars protecting land to protect our rural legacy, to protect our waterways, to ensure the health of the bay. And if we're just willing to throw that away and allow eminent domain, I do question what our priorities are here.
If that's the case, do you believe that having that protection from conserved and preserved lands really doesn't carry the same weight as it did perhaps before this conversation started with this transmission line specifically, if eminent domain can be used arguably at any time?
I do not think there will be another Marylander that will conserve or preserve any piece of land in Maryland for all time, because there is a contract. I have a conservation easement and a preservation easement on the land that I own. And that contract stipulates what I can and can't do. And that contract is something that the people who signed those agreements agreed to uphold. And the fact that a company out of New Jersey or any company could come in and just rip that contract up and take land is unacceptable.
And then there's the aspect of compensation, fair compensation. I understand one bill would have allowed a 350% of the highest appraisal value if the land were to be taken through eminent domain. Is that acceptable?
The 350%?
Yeah.
Well, I think that piece of legislation was really designed to acknowledge that agricultural land is, by the nature of it being agricultural and by the nature of it being, in some cases, preserved agricultural land, cannot be developed. Mm-hmm. So the dollar value for which you could sell that land is significantly lower than the dollar value you could sell that land to a developer who could put in a set of homes.
Sure.
So the point of that legislation was to at least equalize folks and not add insult to injury, that you've conserved your land or you choose to farm and your land is worth less value because it is zoned agricultural and you can't develop it, and therefore we're going to give you, the minimum amount of money when we're taking it from you. That is also unacceptable.
All right, Joanne, thank you. We are going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll have a group of state lawmakers will join us to talk about their legislative efforts to protect Marylanders from the impact of the Maryland Piedmont Reliability Project. We'll be right back. Welcome back to this Your Voice, Your Future Town Hall. I'm Mikenzie Frost. Tonight, we're examining the controversial Maryland Piedmont Reliability Project and its future in this state. People from across Maryland have spoken out against the transmission line. A short film produced last year showcased some of their voices. And earlier this month, it won the award for Best Local Film at the Maryland International Film Festival. Take a look.
Every Marylander will feel the impacts of this.
I don't know if anybody should really feel safe.
Outrage. You are going through some of the best soil, farm ground, preserved, natural resources that northern Baltimore County has to offer.
Throughout all of Maryland, I think about the hundreds of families and farmers who are going to be impacted by this.
I mean, I'm sad because, you know, it's coming so close to this house and through these woods, but I'm sad because it's, you know, it's 70 miles of unnecessary destruction.
I'm joined by Stop MPRP President Joanne Frederick, along with state delegates Jesse Pippy and Michelle Guyton and Senator Justin Reedy. Thank you all for joining us virtually and here in studio. I appreciate all of your time. We have a lot of guests, so I'm going to try and divide as much time as we possibly can to everybody here. So before we get to in studio, let's go to Delegate Guyton and talk a little bit about where legislation stands. We're, getting close to the end of session at this point. Can you talk a little bit about some of your priorities with the MPRP and give us an update on where you think we're going to see legislation go?
Sure. Thank you so much for continuing to follow this issue. I think it's so important that you stay on top of it. We are getting to the end of session. Things are wild over here in Annapolis, so I appreciate being able to be virtual today. I had 3 pieces of legislation. As you mentioned before, there were many, many pieces of legislation in both of the buckets that Joanne described before, and I had 3 of those, and they actually were in both buckets as well. The one that most directly addressed the conserved and preserved farmland and agricultural land was House Bill 631. So we were really, really hopeful that we could get this through. This was a very simple bill. I think it's the one she was referring to earlier that just said you cannot take land that has already been promised to can be conserved and preserved and by eminent domain. You just can't do it. So I think in Maryland, the Beautiful Act was passed in 23, and this was in my committee, the Environment Committee. And we made a commitment, the state of Maryland made a commitment to preserve 600,000 acres of land. The proposed line for the Maryland Piedmont Reliability Project would cut that in half. It would take almost 250 acres of already preserved land for this project under eminent domain, and that's just not okay. So that was what we were trying to stop with that piece of legislation. It has not moved forward on its own, but I will bring it back in a different form next year, hopefully addressing it through a more environmental lens so that we can get it out of the energy committees and into the environment committees and hopefully make some stronger strides on that. But the 2 other bills actually have moved forward. So we have with Senator Karen Lewis Young and also with Senator Ben Brooks, I have 2 bills, one to put guardrails on these projects for the future, and the other one to at least force the companies to look at the impact that they're having on conserved and preserved agricultural land and environmentally conserved lands. So both of those actually are going through in another piece of legislation. It's House Bill 829, which is sponsored by Delegate Lori Charkoudian, and word for word has both of these bills included in it. It's a large piece of legislation. Requiring considerations, that plans fit within local and state transmission planning processes, requiring alternative routes to make sure that this is the only way that we can do this. And also directly from our bills, it has to detail the impacts that these projects have on the environment. And I think we just heard today that the current plan has been put on hold. There's a pause there. And I'll tell you what, that really excites me because we were concerned that this bill wouldn't go into effect until October 1st and that wouldn't be soon enough. With these new developments, it may in fact be soon enough. So thank you.
Delegate Guyton, thank you for that. Delegate Pippi, walk me through the impact that you're hearing from your constituents on this proposal. I mean, we know that the town halls have been incredibly passionate from people who have expressing their concern. Is this still a priority for them?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, look, the nightmare has not ended. We've been dealing with this since June, when a lot of us local leaders found out about the project. You mentioned the town hall. We had a town hall where nearly 1,000 people showed up. So we've been fighting ever since. As was just alluded to, there was significant legislation introduced this year to address a lot of the concerns that we heard. You know, what about our environmentally protected areas? What about our farmland? You know, what about small businesses that this project would overcome? And so we were exuberant to hear today that the Public Service Commission has actually put the project kind of back in the hands of the applicant to make sure that they're going about it the right way. But our work is not done. People still have significant concerns about this project, and it's just been a nightmare. It's literally been a nightmare since they found out about it.
Senator Reedy, I want to bring you into this conversation. What message do you think that it sends to people who have these land conservations and the protected land through agriculture? If those protections are not honored through the eminent domain process, what message does it send to them that how the state values that contract and their property?
Well, I think it devalues the trust that's been made between people who took the step of putting their land in that easement. We celebrate Carroll County. I have a little piece of Frederick County in my district, but Carroll County is the large part of my district, and we have a robust local program in addition to the state program of preserving land. And this literally looks like this just targeted all that open land, and a lot of what comes across the Carroll County portion, I know, and I think it's true of the other counties, is going right through these conservation easements. And so, yeah, it sends a terrible message. And I've had legislation to try to get that 350% value for ag land. Haven't been able to get that through. Had another piece of legislation to try to get at least get attorney's fees back if someone contests a corporate-driven eminent domain procedure. The hesitancy seems to be establishing precedents about the eminent domain process. But I've co-sponsored legislation with Senator Lewis Young on data centers and some other legislation that's made it through. I think Delegate Guyton mentioned with Senator Brooks about trying to really get guardrails around data centers, but also make sure we're understanding the decisions we make and how it impacts our electric grid, because we really want to try to avoid this nightmare being visited on anybody else, while we're also obviously trying to stop this from happening to our community.
Yeah, it's certainly a multifaceted issue, and I want to get to some of the energy issues a little bit later in the town hall. I will also point out that Delegate Lewis Young was invited to participate. Senator Lewis Young, I'm sorry, apologize for that. Senator Lewis Young was invited to participate in this conversation, but he declined that invitation, so we aren't able to have his input in this. Moving forward to next year, I mean, we have just days left in session, and a lot of these pieces of legislation don't seem to be moving forward at this point. Some are, but not all of them. Do you think that given the pause or the concerns raised about the application right now, will these bills be a priority for all of you? We'll start with Delegate Pippi next session, given that it doesn't seem like this transmission line plan is moving forward at this point.
Well, I'll tell you this. I think the fact that both Republicans and Democrats are united on this issue, and that we have, you know, my colleague, Delegate Guyton, and I have co-sponsored each other's legislation. We're supportive of each other, from the dog catcher to the U.S. Senator who was the senior member on the Energy Committee in the U.S. Senate. We've all raised significant concerns, and I think that has had a chilling effect on the Public Service Commission, quite frankly. And I think that's one of the reasons why probably the project was punted, or at least sent back to the drawing board. And that's really what we wanted. What we want is to ensure that if this project should go through, that it's in the best interest of the public and that it benefits Marylanders. And right now, we don't think it does.
Joanne, does it give you any hope to hear lawmakers right now talk about continuing this conversation into the next legislative session?
Absolutely, and great credit to the lawmakers that are here tonight and the rest that we've been working with and have been so responsive and so cooperative and willing to take on this hard fight here in Maryland for the people across the three counties. I've said it before, I'll say it again, it makes me proud to be a born and raised Marylander, and I'm happy to stay in the fight with them as long as it takes.
Delegate Guyton, why do you think some of these pieces of legislation, given the importance to so many people, didn't make it out of committee this year?
Sure. Well, I mean, I'm happy that some of it did, and we're hopeful that that will be enough to have an impact, at least to slow down this project.
Sure.
some of the bills, including mine on eminent domain, were very bold. They really were. And so I agree with Senator Reedy that sort of shifted the way that folks had to think about these projects and about eminent domain, and it set a precedent that maybe some folks weren't ready to make yet. But now we've got the conversation started. I think that there are many other avenues that we can take. We can address it in different ways. And I do want to say that I've said it before, this is the first big project. This is not the last. This is an issue that Maryland, Republicans, Democrats, governor, whom we will try to get that meeting for you, Joanne. We all have to work together on this issue because it's not going away. It's only going to get worse, and we need these guardrails in place, and we need to keep this work really front of mind. So I love that my colleagues on both sides of the aisle and both sides of the street are all working together on this.
All right, we're going to continue this conversation as soon as we take a quick break. We'll be right back.
I'm raging, really angry, and I'm ready to fight, and I'm devastated.
We built our house over on the next. Sorry.
I guess I look at it now as, yeah, it broke my heart. It's the end of all of this that we were taking care of, but.
Welcome back to this Your Voice, Your Future Town Hall. I'm Mikenzie Frost. Tonight, we're examining the controversial Maryland Piedmont Reliability Project and its future in this state. I'm joined by Stop MPRP President Joanne Frederick, along with state delegates Jesse Pippy and Michelle Guyton, and Senator Justin Reedy. Thank you all for joining us again in studio and virtually. Senator Reedy, I want to go first to you. How does this transmission line proposal fit into the state's larger energy outlook, given the fact that we know Maryland imports 40% of its energy needs? There's a larger conversation happening in Annapolis this session about energy generation. How does this fit into that?
Well, it's really interesting because the excuse given for doing this line is not, the underlying reason is not an illegitimate reason, which is we do need more energy in the state. We are not producing enough, as you just mentioned. Now, the problem, of course, is this line, as we've talked about tonight, and as viewers that have followed this know, this line doesn't really bring any power into the state. It does allegedly help stabilize the grid, but there's no real benefit to Maryland ratepayers at the cost of 70 miles of largely of farmland and wooded area. So the issue, though, is Maryland does need to take steps to increase its, I'll call it domestic, its in-state energy production. I actually think when we talk about why some legislation's gotten held up or pieces of it have gotten attached to other bills, it's partly because there's been so much about energy in the energy committees that they've been a little overwhelmed. And I mean, to be charitable to them, that there's been so much thrown at them. And so we need to increase our energy, our reliable, affordable energy production in the state. That includes natural gas, it includes nuclear. So that's the challenge. But this project doesn't really address that issue because all it's doing is building basically an I-95 from southern Pennsylvania to northern Virginia.
Delegate Guyton, in your conversations with stakeholders in this, have you been able to get a clear understanding of the actual benefits to the state of Maryland and the people that are going to be impacted by this from this transmission line, or is it really going to be an extension cord?
You know, unfortunately, I have to agree with Senator Reedy there. I think that the direct benefits to Maryland are small, if not infinitesimal. We do know that if we don't have these extra lines, then we may have problems with the grid. We may have brownouts, but only because we have to get that energy through somewhere. And if it doesn't come through that line, it will come from somewhere else and maybe from parts of Maryland. I agree with the senator. I think we have to start looking at other sorts of energy. We have to become more energy independent, even within our tiny little state. And I think you're seeing people on both sides of the aisle. Certainly, I'm a Democrat, but I absolutely agree that we have to move toward modern nuclear technology to ever get to clean energy in Maryland. And that takes a while. So we have a long way to go. We need to get started now.
Definitely. Delegate Pippy, do you think that we're in this situation given all of the concerns because the General Assembly has pushed other priorities onto lawmakers when it comes to the environmental priorities? Is this a result of an over-prioritization and a lack of realization of the needs?
Listen, I think our energy crisis in the state is definitely self-inflicted. As you just said, we have been pushing out energy producers for decades, and we're having to import more and more energy. But what's ironic about this whole thing is this transmission line project is for the benefit of Virginia. When you add the adverse impact of this project on Marylanders, who, by the way, are getting the bill to build this project, there's very little benefit, very little, if any at all. And that's what both parties have been saying. Republicans and Democrats alike have been saying, look, there is no benefit to a Marylander for this project, and it's so devastating. And so, you know, in addition to the energy crisis that we're facing, the outrageous energy costs, we now have this power line going through, which brings no benefit. And these are the concerns we've been raising for months now.
Joanne, if this project continues and at some point this is built, what other options do you have?
From a property owner perspective? None. None, Mikenzie, and I think that's the crime of all of this, that essentially this project is being forced down the throats of almost 500 property owners across the 3 counties for something that won't benefit us, for something, as Delegate Pippy mentioned, we have to pay for. It is injustice on a scale that's almost difficult to quantify. I cannot imagine waking up every morning and looking out across the 100-acre farm that once belonged to my great-grandparents and seeing a transmission line.
Critics of the opposition would just say that it's a need that the state has to do, and you know, if it's an optic situation, then so be it. How do you respond to that?
There are alternatives. There are ways to upgrade the existing lines. There are grid enhancing technologies. There is the ability to use high voltage direct current lines that could be buried. There is a way to distribute energy among and throughout the communities so we don't need giant transmission lines at 500,000 volts running through our property. Those opportunities, and particularly the advanced grid technologies, can be implemented in a few years. So we should start there. And while we're starting there, take the time to step back, like Senator West's bill said, and do a task force on really the state of energy in Maryland, where we want to go, who we are, get all the data together, get really smart people in the room, and figure this out. There is an answer.
And I was just going to say, look, I mean, we've certainly introduced legislation to address alternative routes, but what we have found is that this New Jersey company thought they found the path of least resistance. And in fact, they've run into tens of thousands of Marylanders that are putting up a real fight. And those lawmakers are leading that fight, and we're going to be the path of the most resistance because we're going to do everything we can to prevent this project from going through.
Senator Reedy, you have legislation, if I'm not mistaken, about establishing a task force to develop realistic an electricity plan. Is that correct for the state?
Yes, that's another bill that I put in. It has not moved. That was really aimed at looking at what we need to do before plants are shut down. Maryland has closed nearly 30 power plants in the last several years, with more slated to close soon, which is another argument for why they say we need this power line.
Right.
Brandon Shores in Anne Arundel County is one of them. So my bill was trying to say, we need a better process before these plants close. Now, some of them are privately owned, and so it's a little bit of a dance figuring out. It's not that the state owns it, but the state provides a lot of subsidy for those owners. So we need to slow that process down. That bill has not moved, unfortunately, but it is part of the larger discussion about energy. We've got to not take more plants offline until we can figure out just kind of what the heck is going on. And I thought that, Joanne explained it very well as to why Senator Westbill also that concept is very important.
Sure. Well, and I know that part of the legislative leadership package from Democrats in both the House and the Senate includes a bill that would look at doing a study as well and to help plan. Delegate Guyton, do you believe that the state should have already been doing better planning and forecasting for the energy needs before we got to this situation in the first place?
Well, I think the state can always do better, but to be completely honest and transparent about this issue, we as state representatives are working hard to deal with the project that's going through our districts.
Sure.
But the state doesn't control this. This is an issue with the federal government, with the 13 state compact that we have to provide energy for all of those areas. And the state can only do so much. And I think we're showing that we'll do everything we can, but really it's going to come down to FERC and the federal government to figure this out ultimately, with the state doing everything we can to make an impact. But, I certainly feel it. I'm a resident in North County, been there forever. I can see a lot of that area from my house. I live on the edge of a state park, and it breaks my heart in the same way that I see some of these constituents who are on this film. And hopefully we can slow it down and change the trajectory of this and future projects.
Do you believe that if some of these pieces of legislation, you mentioned this earlier, Delegate Guyton, about starting the conversation, and while some of these bills might not be successful this session, potentially it could open the door and there might be success in future years. But if it's not this proposal, if it's not the MPRP, and if these bills aren't successful this year, is there any concern that we're just kicking the can down the road and saying, we'll try again next year, we'll try again next year, and before you know it, these transmission lines are up? Delegate Guyton.
I hope not. I'm sorry. I thought you were speaking to me.
Yep.
I hope not, and I think not. I really believe that we get started with this pause that we already have been given. We've been given a gift today, right? And we should make the most of that. There is not a Senate sponsor, I believe, for Delegate Charkoudian's bill 829, but that's going to make the process much harder for anybody who wants to build these transmission lines through Maryland. Again, I would love to see that go through the Senate. It's already passed the House, but I would also love to see it change from an effective date of October 1st to being an emergency bill that goes into effect the minute that it's passed. I think that will have an effect. I don't think those of us who are here or those of us who have worked on these bills are kicking anything down the road. We are doing everything in our power. Unfortunately, we don't have the ultimate power in this situation.
Delegate Pippi, looking ahead to next session, it looks like that's where a lot of this conversation will go. We know that the energy package from the Democrat leadership at this point is a priority. They plan to get this done. Do you think that the conversation that has been started now will give a signal to leadership that this is something they must prioritize next session?
I do. And I think lawmakers in general, especially the ones that represent Frederick, Carroll, and Baltimore County, have done a great job at highlighting the concerns of this project, highlighting the flaws in the application of the CPCN process in general. And I think that has raised the awareness to the point where leadership is forced to address the issue. And I also think it does, like, as I mentioned earlier, have an impact on the PSC because they're seeing what we're doing in Annapolis. Look, Annapolis regulates the PSC, which the PSC then regulates these energy providers and others. So, you know, we're all in this together. And I think we've done a heck of a job at making this one of the most important issues in our state, period. And that's what the people wanted us to do. And I think we will see some movement on the issue.
All right. Well, many critics of the MPRP are calling for the PSC to look into alternatives for the transmission line. We'll hear from some experts about possible alternatives right after this. Welcome back to this Your Voice, Your Future Town Hall. I'm Mikenzie Frost. Tonight we're examining the controversial Maryland-Piedmont Reliability Project and its future in the state. Critics are calling for alternative options to the transmission line. Joining me now to talk about some possible alternatives is Sinclair's Senior Vice President of Advanced Technology, Mark Aiken. Thank you. And President of Grid Strategies, Rob Gramlich. Thank you both for joining us. Rob, I want to start with you. Talk a little bit about, if you can, the importance of the reliability of the grid and how PJM, the regional grid operator, kind of factors in the needs and where energy goes, and how does all of that work?
Sure. Well, PJM is responsible for a 13-plus state area and making sure there's reliability around the grid, which includes all the transmission lines. And so it has looked at this situation and looked at growing load, not just in Virginia, but Maryland and across really the whole region, and determined that there are a whole bunch of points on the grid that are points of failure. The map literally lights up. I know you love maps. Now, they are just looking at an electrical map, importantly, right? And they're not thinking about land use. There's another sort of map layer that somebody needs to balance the land use and the other aspects of this line and all lines. But PJM, in terms of what they're doing, they're just looking at substations and lines on a map, and there's all these points that really light up all around Maryland. Maryland is, I guess, unfortunately for a lot of people, kind of at a crossroads for all the economic development and load growth, and then, you know, lines that will probably, certainly lines will be needed. Whether it's this route or another route, that's a question.
And do you think that the fact that Maryland imports 40% of its energy needs, factors into that, and whether a transmission line like this or, like you said, a future one, I mean, if the energy isn't coming to Maryland like the MPRP, how does that really benefit the needs of the state if it's serving as a pass-through on the grid?
Sure. Well, I was looking at the Maryland Economic Development website today, and it advertises that this state is a great place for tech industries, including data centers. And it was saying, hey, we're better than the Southeast. We don't have hurricanes. We're better than the West. We don't have wildfires. And we have all the electricity infrastructure you need. Well, I mean, that's a real question. Is there the electricity infrastructure to support it? Is it a state objective to attract these industries? It is a public policy question. All the voices we've heard so far today are very important voices, and there is a question for policymakers. So, I mean, it would be, I think, very helpful for somebody, a state agency, I would think, somebody to say, let's balance all of these interests and put together a plan. Here's the risk. If the Maryland Commission rejects this line based on all the voices you've heard today, a federal judge could say, I'm sorry, it's needed for reliability. It was not very long ago where a Pennsylvania commission rejected a line that Maryland residents needed for power, and then the federal judge said, sorry, it's needed. You can't just stand in the way of an interstate line like that. These are all interstate in the sense that they serve the broader network. Also, it's a very high priority of the current administration in Washington to attract data centers here and not China and not other places. And of course, we're all sitting here, 30, 40 miles from 70% of the global internet, right? We are in the middle, and Frederick County and other areas are trying to attract some of these. So there is a need for infrastructure here. Somebody could put together the plan to balance all these interests, and maybe there are alternative routes. I mean, if you do an alternative grid study, you might find some options.
Or alternative sources of energy, right, Mark? And I know that that's part of the conversation, is looking at other ways to generate this need of energy in the state. What does Maryland need to do if there's so much opposition to this transmission line? And, nuclear has been part of the conversation in Annapolis, but that takes time. Is there more of an immediate, step that can be taken?
Well, look, the immediacy is here now. The MPRP certainly has created a conversation that has long been needed. I will agree with one thing with the governor. What he said is this isn't a problem that happened today, yesterday, or 2 years ago. It's been a growing problem. But we have to look at this in planned stages. I hope there is a state level effort on this, but it's got to be a multiplicity of disciplines and people that look at the whole picture and not just part of the picture. You need to do today what you can do today. I would suggest, you drop in an APC 1000 reactor, which is probably the closest thing to being able to bring online, cut some red tape. The experts that I've spoken to from FERC and other consultants say, if you cut the red tape, you could have a nuclear power facility online in 2, 3, 4 years. That's about as immediate as you can get a lot of energy. The longer term plan needs to be, if you want to attract business, you want to attract engineering, you want to attract IT talent, a different view of the grid has to be taken on in terms of a distributed grid where power isn't being generated in one place to go everywhere, but it's being distributed in pockets, if you will, and distributed because that provides a level of redundancy as well. Small modular reactors, people think I'm just a nuclear guy, and that's not at all the case. We're looking for solutions that are immediate and long-term. And I look forward to the day of having something the size of a toaster that's, operating as a plasmoid fusion reactor, but that's a long ways off. We got to do today what we can do today and plan for tomorrow.
Looking at some of the options that are on the table, part of the legislative package right now includes, doing more natural gas generation. And some people, especially in the environmental community, are against that. The purpose of this would be, according to the bill as it's written right now, would require the ability for these natural gas generation stations to be able to transfer to hydrogen as soon as possible. But do you think that would also be a shorter term solution given the significant energy needs that there are in the state?
Look, I'm all for green. I think everybody's for green, for being good stewards. But the fact is that there are plans on the table. But part of the problem for the data centers is it's a consistent base load requirement. I don't know if anybody's ever shut off their computer, but imagine, thousands of those being shut off hard and having to restart. You don't want that. So you need redundancy in the power in those local facilities. I think that there is an immediate gas alternative for powering on a local level some of these data center facilities. There's also the possibility, I know that there are plans on the table, consultants working away at providing a multiplicity of gas-fired facilities with the plan to replace those in the future with a small modular reactor. But again, it's not, reliability, really depends on a distribution of your power assets, not just putting those in one place.
Rob, looking at data centers, I mean, it's a conversation with the MPRP, given the data centers in Virginia, and if it's something that Maryland wants to tout as an industry, would it be good public policy to require energy generation with these data centers as they pop up?
I don't think it'd be good to require that. It's an option. We're going to see on-site generation in data centers around the country. It's going to happen. But
would that help with the grid?
It would, yeah. The problem is, I mean, there's a couple problems. You cannot get a gas turbine for probably about 5 years. We don't have the capacity to build them. They're all, if you haven't bought one already, you're not going to get one. A combined cycle even longer. That's into the 2030s. And of course, nuclear is 2032 or 3 at the earliest. So none of those are like immediate. They don't solve the problem right away, as people might hope and think. And on-site generation, I think there will be some sort of hybrid power on-site in some areas, but that's only, I mean, the data centers will do that as a last resort. They really want the grid power. They're only going to build somewhere where they think they can get the grid power, in the fairly near term, even if not immediately.
By the way, I mean, it's one of the reasons that you've got so many of the high-powered tech firms looking at coming together. There's a pledge that was recently made by 3 of the largest tech companies who rely on data centers, and their commitment is jointly to triple the amount of nuclear energy that's generated over the next 2 decades. So there is a concerted effort on the part of multiple parties. If a state's not going to solve the problem, they're going to solve the problem. If the federal government's not going to solve the problem, then we've got a bigger problem. I would reject the notion that nuclear power of any sort has to be 10 years away. Cut the red tape.
At the state level or the federal level, or both?
At both levels. At both levels. But I think if the state could pierce that, then at the federal level it becomes a much easier level. And I've talked to many folks, both currently and in the past, with FERC. And they say, you want nuclear power, you could have it in 2, 3, 4 years at the outside if you cut the red tape, take a proven technology, a proven reactor technology, and put that on site.
Sounds like there's a lot of technology that still needs to be developed to make some of those plans a reality. Unfortunately, that is all the time that we have. I appreciate everyone for joining us. Our panelists online, in person, all of these conversations this evening are incredibly important. Thank you for joining us at home as well. This is Your Voice, Your Future Town Hall, Fox 45.